Hello and welcome back to JJ Videos. I am JJ and this is my face. Yes, I have a face. I'm not just a pair of disembodied hands. I do in fact have one of these. So as you can tell from the title today, we are going to be talking about Primaris Marines and the Firstborn Marines together. And to keep this, neutral and a safe space for everyone involved, what we are going to do, rather than just, painting a Space Marine of the Firstborn or Primaris, because I understand that could be quite triggering for some people, is I'm going to paint something that everyone can agree on, that absolutely everyone can come together and agree they despise in the Primaris and Firstborn circle. We're going to be painting this Hellbrute. I figured it's a more politically safe decision to paint something that both sides can't stand, rather than getting involved in saying who deserves to be in this video. So, without further ado, let's talk Space Marines, Firstborn and Primaris. There are two things I want to say before we get too far into it. First of all, there's going to be a few less pictures and memes in this video, just because I want to make sure you can see what I'm doing. And secondly, I want to state, first of all, as much as I do like Firstborn, I think the Primaris were a genuinely good addition, and I'm really excited that they're here. I think Games Workshop did something fantastic when they brought them on board, because they're good for both the lore, and they're good for the game as well, I think. I just wanted to get those two things out of the way before we went any further. Right, let's crack on. So, I think the first thing to state is the basics here. In terms of timeline, the Firstborn have been around for over 30 years, and in those 30 years they have changed immeasurably. And they've changed with the seasons, they've changed with editions, but they've also been moved by things like the Horus Heresy, they've been moved as the game has changed, and I think whenever we have had a new edition of 40k, as I said in one of my previous videos, we've always had a new Space Marine Codex, which has always meant that Space Marines reliably change with the editions, so we've got a very good sense of progress. And as a result, that 30 years has given rise and fall, unfortunately, to a lot of kits, a lot of models, a lot of characters, and a lot of ideas that have gone through the Space Marine Codex over the years, some of which have stuck around and some of which have gone, as I said. Now, Primaris, on the other hand, have only been around for 3 years, only existed ever in 8th and 9th edition, so we don't have the same sense of history that we have with Firstborn. For example, Primaris didn't exist during the era of the vehicle hull points, which, most people don't remember fondly. I don't. I still think that was a terrible idea, but moving on. And they are still largely ubiquitous to all the chapters. Firstborn have been such an intrinsic part that all of the special units to the other chapters, so Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Space Wolves, are very much part of those in their other units, and that's how they appear. Bloodclaws, Grey Hunters, Longfangs, Deathwing, Ravenwing, all of those are still Firstborn, and have been Firstborn for now. I know a lot of players want Primaris units for all of those models, but that's not happened just yet, and I think it's important to remember that when we still think of chapters like Space Wolves, most of their identity is wrapped up in Firstborn Marines. I'd argue the same is true of Dark Angels as well. And obviously, Grey Knights still have no Primaris, which, as a side note, I genuinely think is a fascinating thing, and I'm curious to see what Games Workshop are going to do with that in the future. So that's what I mean in terms of adding to the mystery of what it is. Now, the next thing I think to talk about is that with Primaris, there is still this feel that they're more in line with the old legions of the Horus Heresy, where every unit had the same equipment and were more dedicated to their role. You could argue, because of how new 40k is played, that everything can hurt everything, and therefore everything is valid, but I would still argue that even if that was the case, intercessors equipped with any one of the 3 different types of bolt gun, it's still a bolt gun. They don't have rocket launchers, they don't have melter guns, they don't have flamers, and that's what I mean by that. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the similarities between them, which is something which a lot of people are probably raising an eyebrow at the moment. It's going, what do you mean, similarities? Yes, well, they are similar in many ways. First of all, the obvious one, they're both Space Marines. A Primaris Space Marine and a Firstborn Space Marine are both Space Marines. The difference is, as much as they are there and are quite intrinsic, still are all overridden by the fact these are both Space Marines. They have access to all of the same special rules, the same chapter traits, they have much of the same identity, they don't have the same history, but they still very much view themselves as Space Marines, even if the Primaris are so new in the canon and in the lore, and to us, that they almost feel like they're something else in some respects, but the fact is they're not. They are still Space Marines. The other thing is, in terms of the units we have on the tabletop, and to a lesser extent in the lore, because that's still being created, they feel very similar battlefield roles. So they both have heavy weapon squads, jump infantry, bikers, their characters all for very different similar roles. So we aren't seeing differences there. We haven't got a hitherto unforeseen character for the Primaris, and we haven't seen the Primaris with massive gaps in the characters they have available to them, such as chaplains or tech marines now. I think there was a bit of debate whether or not they'd get tech marines, but they have them now, and it's good. Everyone's happy. I'm happy. I hope you're happy. But that's where I think the similarities are, and they're the important ones. The next thing we need to talk about are the differences, unfortunately. The big difference is obviously things like the distribution of heavy and special weapons. As I said before, Primaris have more homogenized units where everyone's equipped with the same thing, whereas the Firstborn, because of their more tactically flexible background, have spread out where the heavy and special weapons go, and that also includes things like power weapons, power fists, and also who gets access to things like jump packs and bikes. It's a bit more spread out and far less concentrated, but where it is concentrated for the Primaris, it has given rise to letting us experiment more with what they are concentrating. Just as a very quick thing, Inceptor squads effectively carrying 2 heavy bolters in each hand, short range, granted, but they are a fast Devastator squad, as someone pointed out to me, the same with suppressors. They can move, they can shoot heavy weapons, they can do a lot of damage, the kind of damage that previously you would only see on tanks or in Devastator squads for Firstborn, but obviously there's less of them. And that brings me on to my next difference. Firstborn reliably have numbers. This isn't the case in every squad, because obviously you can have 10 Intercessors and 10 Hellblasters, the same way you can have 10 Devastators and 10 Tactical Marines. And arguably, those 10 Devastators do not put out the same amount of firepower as those 10 Hellblasters. However, those 10 Hellblasters do cost more in points, so at that point it swings in roundabouts. But when we even talk about the elite squads, as rare as they are, you can have 10 Terminators, and now 10 Terminators is 30 wounds on the board, which is terrifying. Think back 5 years, 30 wounds is 2 full-strength Bloodclaw squads. That's quite a big jump between then and now. But then we kind of cast this over a little bit further, and then we look at the other units for Primaris. Blade Guard, Aggressors can't have more than 9 models in any of those units. I think Blade Guard can only have 6. So they're restricted to smaller units overall. Even the Centurions, which I think have the same number of wounds, they can have similar size squads to Primaris units, but in terms of the general... But then we cast over to the other ones, Tactical Squads, Devastator Squads, Assault Squads, Vanguard, Stern Guard. They could all have access to 10-man units, and that's a good thing. Now, the other thing I want to point out at this point is, and the next difference is access to transports. At the moment, Primaris only realistically have 3 transports, which are the 2 versions of the Repulsor and the Impulsor, and that is it. That's all they have. Whereas the Firstborn Marines, they have Rhinos, Razorbacks, 3 different variants of Land Raider, the Space Marine Codex, they have access to the Storm Raven, they have access, well, the Death Watch have their own flyer. Everyone has access to transports to move around the board quicker. And in terms of speed, that makes Firstborn arguably a bit faster when it comes to mechanized assault, whereas Primaris do not have that just yet. They may get that in the future, but for now, they do not have that same level of speed in terms of their armor. I would say that there is a level of difference in the vehicles as well, but I think that comes down more to the fact that the Primaris vehicles are all brand new. A lot of the Space Marine vehicles we've had for the last few years have very much been slow coming, and I do know that Games Workshop has struggled a lot over the years to get vehicles into the game. I remember being told the story that they never thought there would ever be vehicles in 40k at all, and that's something which is quite interesting in my opinion, because I'm far too young to remember that, but apparently that was once a thing. But those are the similarities and the differences, and I think this is kind of where we need to break down a little bit what it also means between the differences between the two of them, and that's a force organizational chart thing. So the first thing to look at is in terms of the distribution. So Firstborn Marines are very heavy in the elite section and the fast attack section now. So in your elite section, you have your Stern Guard, your Vanguard, your Company Veterans, you have 3 more characters, Apothecary, Company Champion, and Standard Bearer, and obviously Terminators and Assault Centurions. And in the heavy support section, you've got your Devastator squads, your Devastator Centurions. In the fast attack, you've got Bikes, Assault squads. But this is the difference when it comes to their troops units, their core units. Firstborn Marines only have 1 unit, and that is the Tactical Squad. Whereas the Primaris, on the other hand, are a bit more evenly spread. So as much as they do have Blade Guard, Aggressors, and the Redemptor Dreadnought, obviously, and the Reavers in the elites, they still have access to 5 different troop units, which are the Intercessor, the Assault Intercessor, Incursor, Infiltrator, and the Heavy Intercessor. Now, it may seem one-sided, but when you look at it in that respect, you have to remember a tactical squad has more options than any of those do. Like I said before, you can have 3 different types of bolt gun, but it's still a bolt gun. That's the important thing to remember here. Intercessors can't have rocket launchers. They can't have heavy flamers. They can't have missile launchers or plasma cannons. They cannot have plasma guns or grav guns. And that's a big difference. That's a fundamental difference. So if you want your Intercessors, they will be very useful with their bolt guns when it comes to fighting infantry and maybe the lightest of the light vehicles, but ultimately they still won't have that flexibility on the tabletop that a tactical squad should be able to bring. So knowing that is an important thing to remember when it comes to talking about Space Marines and where the flexibility lies. Stratagems seem to be far more relevant to the Primaris these days. Primaris and the new Space Marine Codex have 9 stratagems dedicated to themselves. Firstborn only have 3. Now that's quite a big difference when you think about the two of them side by side, but I genuinely think some of that comes down to the older codexes being more in line with pushing Primaris, understandably, and Firstborn being left behind, and that's something I feel we may see changing as time goes by. And I suppose you're wondering now, at this point, Josh, so we've talked about Primaris and Firstborn a lot side by side, but where's the versus? Where's the conflict? Where's one better than the other? And this is where I want to get to my most controversial point. I think that if we start talking about Primaris versus Firstborn, we're already talking about them wrong. We're not talking about one being better than the other, because ultimately they are still both Space Marines. So the word I want to put out there now, and I hope everyone will use this from now on, is synergy. The actual blending of the two working together. Because yes, Primaris units are more homogenized, they have more attack output in combat. Most of their weapons are more concentrated in different areas. But because of it, they are far easier to isolate as an opponent. If you look at where the heavy weapons are on your Primaris army, they are far more easy to locate and eliminate than they are in a first. And this is what I mean, is that one should be supporting the other. It's never, in my opinion, been a case of Primaris taking over and replacing Firstborn, or Firstborn holding out without Primaris. I genuinely think that the best way to look at them and to approach them is to look at how the two of them work together. And that's, interestingly enough, on the tabletop, whenever I've seen people play with Space Marines, I largely see all Primaris nowadays or all Firstborn. Since 2017, I see maybe one person in 10 playing with a mixed Primaris Firstborn army. But interestingly enough, those are the armies in all 3 codexes that have been released do the best, in my view, every single time. And the reason they do the best is because the two armies are able to bring out the most in each other. The speed you get from having Primaris fast movers, such as their Outriders and their Inceptors, being able to move around and support this faster Space Marine units in vehicles and transports, so tactical squads and rhinos, or even Stern Guard squads and drop pods. They're able to get to a place and support and know that they have the wounds and the damage outputs to help them move the line forward. They are fantastic at capturing objectives, and they're a great support. Similarly, when you have units like Intercessors suddenly being faced down with things like Land Raiders, you have Devastator squads and even just regular tactical squads there with heavy weapons that can start taking chunks out of your opponent. Regular characters from the Firstborn range that can go into vehicles and be able to move around the board with a decent amount of speed to get to where they needed to go in a way that Primaris characters can't do without shelling out a lot more points for much bigger vehicles. And all of this leads me to saying that the way we should be looking at Space Marines collectively as players is working them together. Imagine for a sec if we looked at this the same way we look at the Blood Angels and the Dark Angels codexes, where people were only playing Deathwing and only playing Ravenwing, which they do. But again, when I see people playing with mixed tactics armies for the Dark Angels, they're the ones that do the best. They take the best parts that their codex has to offer and don't limit themselves to one aspect. Because when you do that, you start shutting yourself off to options, and as a result, you limit what your army can do on the tabletop. And I often find that you then have less fun with it because you can do less with it when you're playing. And when you start to lose in the same way every time, which I personally would think is very frustrating. So to conclude, when I think about this going forward, and I generally think about the many different assets in terms of how Space Marines work, is that there are so many different ways to make Space Marines work. I think it's now about people finding the right combinations for them. And if that does lean more towards Primaris or Firstborn, that's fine. But I think that no player should completely eliminate either or from their list. Every Firstborn player, I think, should give Primaris a chance, and everyone who's now playing Primaris should at least keep their eye on the Firstborn units, because I'm sure they'll have something in there that will work for them. And I kind of want to sum up all of this by pointing out 2 more things. The first thing is that the speculation that Primaris were going to overtake Firstborn, I think, can now be Games Workshop made a lot of noise about Firstborn Marines going up to 2 wounds. Now, in my opinion, that was a watershed moment for Space Marines. That was one of the biggest things to ever happen to them. Because you have to remember that a Space Marine battle company last year was 100 wounds for just your squads. It's now 200 wounds. That's amazing. It's even more, arguably, if you're using bikes instead of assault squads. And when you think about that 5 years ago in 2015, there's even more wounds there now than there was before. Bikes now have 3 wounds. They have tripled the number of wounds they've had in 5 years. Space Marine tactical squads have doubled that number. You now have as many wounds in one squad of Terminators that you did in a full-strength squad of Blood Claws
5 years ago. That is an enormous change for Space Marines, and I think it helps reinforce that Space Marines and Primaris can now stand together. They are as resilient as each other, and they have different strengths. Put them together, that's when you see the best coming out of both of them. And I do hope that out there this will sink in with some people and you'll start to see that difference. And I'd say be open, be willing to use them both, be happy to run your intercessors next to your tactical squads, run your inceptor squads alongside your assault marines, and see what happens. I'm confident, and I am actually very interested to see the results, and I also want to see lists that people write with this in mind. Go away, whoever's listening to this, open your codex and write a list from one of the established chapters or from a chapter of your own creation, which is incidentally going to be my next video, and post it below. Tell me what your combinations you come up with, and I'd love to see that, because I think one of the big things about Space Marines now is there's so many options, they are so customizable that every single person could create a list which is unique to them. And if it ever comes down to playing Space Marines versus Space Marines, those games are going to get very interesting, because I see it now as there are so many of us playing and it's such a big codex and such a big army. No two Space Marine armies should ever be the same. So there we have it, the Hellbrute all finished up. I did the base and the chain, which I missed whilst doing him the first time around. But I think he looks all right. I'm quite happy with all that. But thank you so much again for watching. Like and subscribe below, as I'm hoping that you were happy to see my face for a change. Hopefully I'll do a bit more of that in the future. So goodbye, friends, and have a lovely day.